Brian Metzler, it's a pleasure to have you on the Singletrack Podcast.
Yeah, stoked to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
There are four categories that I want to hang around in this conversation. The first one is, I'll call it the content preferences of trail running fans. And as I was preparing for this conversation, I was just thinking about other sports. And I know for the record, trail running is a totally unique entity with its own historical forces, but most other sports have media outlets that are totally dedicated to the professional part of the sport. And one of the things that's unique about our sport is almost every single media outlet, with few exceptions, is mixing in training content, gear reviews, other human interest storylines alongside pro race coverage. And I have a bunch of questions off this, but the first one is, do you think that there is enough fandom in our sport for there to be a self-sustaining pro trail running media outlet right now?
That's a really good question. I think that you certainly hit the nail on the head. I mean, with fandom, I think that if you look at other sports, basketball, football, baseball, all those, soccer, I think that, largely the audience is spectators, right? Certainly people play those sports on their own or did play those sports. The difference with our world is that everyone is in this sport, right? Presumably, right? Running, whether it be just running in general, running ultras, running at the same events that most of the pros are running. They aspire to run Western or some of the UTMB races. So I think that that's the biggest difference compared to other sports. And I think that we're unique to ourselves, but we're not maybe unique to other, what I would call smaller niche sports that are have a super passionate base of people, whether it be, you can name them curling, orienteering, things like that.
Yeah.
Could be the same way. I'm not all that familiar with all the depth of that, but certainly I think in trail running, which maybe parallels what triathlon went through, the people are immersed in it on their own, so for their own training, their own goals, their own interest in finishing a race or improving, things like that. So I think that's the challenge. I think certainly trail running has grown, and certainly there's more of a kind of a following of the pro athletes. But it's also pretty small still, I think. I mean, I think, we could name the top, 50 or 100 runners right now and then go, oh, who's next, right? I mean, meaning it's grown, it's big, and it's great, but it's also smaller than we think relative to the outside world.
Are there any, in your opinion, fundamental roadblocks for why a casual fan who does not participate in the sport in any capacity can still be a fan of the sport and be interested in following? Like, I was just thinking about my own content consumption habits. Like, I listen to the Dan Le Batard show. I listen to Bill Simmons. I listen to Old Man in the Three with JJ Redick. I love basketball, but I have been nowhere near a basketball court in the last 10 years. So is there anything that we're having an issue with in our sport that prevents the casual fan from getting invested?
I said for a long time that I think that the supreme focus on ultra in our sport is both very good, but also challenging in that we know there's a lot of money going in ultra. A lot of the athletes that are highlighted are in ultra, and that's great because that's a lot of where the sport is evolving. At the same time, most trail runners, if you did a casual survey of friends, neighbors, coworkers, or people across the country in St. Louis or wherever that were runners that might identify with trail running. Oh, I love trail running. Oh, I went to this trail run, right? And so we can all absorb that part of it. But I think when it gets to, talking about 100-mile runs or 200-mile runs or UTMB or things like that, I think that we tend to lose a lot of that audience because they just can't relate. I mean, the number of people that do 100-milers, let's say, or 200-milers, is pretty small, right? And there's people that aspire to have that same experience, to run in the mountains, even to maybe run a 14 or things like that are aspirational for sure. But I think that the number of people that actually run those, I think are pretty small. We know the number of ultra finishes are going up, and that's all great. But I do think that from a broad-based spectrum, even if you compare it to marathon and running, I mean, the number of runners and then those who do marathons is a pretty big gap. And certainly the number of people who run or casually trail run or are genuinely interested in trail running, and the people who do ultra, that's a big gap. And so I think that that's one of the things that's challenging because it's just not feasible to think that the majority of people in the realm of trail running are going to do 100-miler, or even should, right?
One of the things you mentioned there was the relatability piece. And when I talk with a lot of folks in our sport, that does seem to be one of the key variables. I've always actually questioned it a little bit because when I think of, again, going back to other sports that I personally follow, like I just finished watching Hard Knocks on HBO for the Arizona Cardinals. And I look at a guy like JJ Watt. He's like 6'5", 275 pounds. He can totally manhandle fellow human beings, but I'm still interested in the content. Yet there's no way that I can relate with his existence on this earth. So can you get into detail about why it's imperative for us to be relatable as a sport in order to reach a general audience?
Yeah, I think that in the early days of these crazy endurance sports we're all involved with, I mean, like ABC's Wide World of Sports did things like cover Ironman or cover, I think they covered Leadville one year with Frank Shorter being the commentator. I think those kind of things certainly brought, this view into these crazy sports to a much wider audience. And I think that's still important today. I think that, the narrower focus of content, whether it be I Run Far or Trail Runner or your podcast or anyone else who's doing these things. Certainly, we have that. We have the close look at the sport, but I think the wider view is still very important. I think that things like when they did the Barkley movie a couple of years ago, or a long time ago, there was a thing about Western State. All these things. I think those things are important because then they can really get intrigued about oh, what's trail running? Can I do that? Or it looks intriguing. I want to try that. Right. Again, not assuming that people will, just jump into 100 milers, but I think that just seeing it from a pulled back point of view. I mean, like everybody talks in sports media about being too inside baseball. Right. And that means that people love baseball, but they don't want to know what, someone's whip is or what someone's slugging percentage is. Right. But I think that certainly there's a way to talk about trail running or bring it to an audience that is not obviously so granular that we all inside this sport love and know and feel and vibe on every day, But I think that to get it bigger, to get it truly bigger, would take kind of like that wider view.
When you think about the various media outlets that have been stood up over the last 2-3 decades, I mean, you have on the ground experience at Trail Runner Mag, I Run Far, Free Trail, etc. And I don't want to speak for everybody because they all have their reasons for doing what they do, but most of them have had this medley of content. It's been the training-based stuff, it's been the gear reviews, and then the coverage, and then the storylines. Did they pursue those angles, in your opinion, because that was the viable business model at the time, and maybe they were making concessions around what they truly wanted to cover? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think I think media in our space is a little bit tough, and I know one of the questions you had primed me with beforehand with email was kind of what was Trail Runner magazine like when we started it, and this is summer fall of 1999. Trail running was tiny compared to what it is today, but there was still a big following too, and by big I mean there was lots of people again interested in Western States. Western States was already a very competitive thing, but at the same time it was tiny. It was there wasn't a lot of trail running gear. There wasn't a lot of trail running kind of outside the niche of what the sport was, But I think to your point, I mean, covering it, I think that again gets back to your audience is largely people that are doing the sport, right? So gear reviews are both information and service to those runner readers, and certainly, business model. I mean, if you want to get the brands interested in what you're doing and showing you're reaching that audience, certainly that's always been a part of kind of coverage, right? And I think you can go down the rabbit hole on gear reviews, but I think that, there's an audience out there. We know it's out there that's passionate, and a lot of people have connected with it, but certainly again, a lot of it, so much of it is tied to people doing the sport.
You mentioned there that because a lot of the audience for these outlets are the runners themselves, they want this actionable content. They want to learn how to become a better runner. I've heard Zoe Rome characterize it as service-based content. And when she, pulls up the hood on all the analytics, it seems to be that content that resonates the most. I guess my question off that is, what do the current content preferences in our sport say about the media-based growth potential here? Do we have to continue to double down on that type of content, or does a change need to happen in some form for the next wave of growth in our sport?
I think certainly we've seen a storm of media happening, right? We know that like a lot of the print models that existed for so many years, a lot of legacy brands, not only in running and trail running, but also other brands have gone away. Digital media, obviously, in a lot of different ways, became the place where marketing directors were putting all their money and getting a lot more optics, getting a lot more kind of understanding of kind of who's watching or who's reading. That being said, I think trail running is still somewhat in its infancy because it's still growing, and we're in this growth period now where anything is possible, right? And it's just a matter of kind of doing it, experimenting with it. I think that what Free Trail is doing is cool. I think there's a lot of good discussion out there that hasn't come out before. I think, one of the comparisons I was thinking about before this talk was that like in 1999, 2000, when we put out the first issue, we had, 6 issues a year. So every 2 months, you're probably looking at if one issue had like 12 to 14 articles of trail running content, right? That's every 2 months. That was the frequency of trail running content, right? Back then, there was some, chat rooms and everything else in the early ages of the internet and stuff like that. But there wasn't, there was Ultra Running magazine, but there wasn't much out there, right? So now there's a lot more out there. And so by understanding kind of what sticks a little bit, we're learning what's possible, right? And I think there is possibility for doing more things. If you look at like running itself, I think that like the stuff that like Stidius Mag is doing for track and marathoning is really cool because it is very athlete based and result based, performance based, right? To my knowledge, they don't do shoe reviews and stuff like that. They do really just athlete interviews, athlete stories, race stories, which is really cool. I think there's a space for that in our side of the sport. It just will take a little bit of effort and time just to get it off the ground.
Another category I want to talk with you about is how to market the sport to a broader audience to create fans. And I know that we were kind of talking about that already here, but just to address it more explicitly, I'm sure that when you come up with a list of like people that have been the most interesting to interview, the Courtneys of the world come up on that list, the Camille's, the Jims, but are there any other people that might not be readily apparent to this audience that you have had discussions with or that you've interviewed with in the past strike you as interesting in the way that they operate in the sport, in the way that they've contributed to the sport, et cetera?
I mean, I think there's a lot of people doing a lot of different things, a lot of people behind the scenes at shoe brands. One of the things that's happened in shoe brands in the last probably 10 years is they've gotten away from sport-specific marketing people and gotten more kind of dynamic real-world marketing positions, or people in those positions, meaning like they see the audience a little bit differently, right? And I think there's a lot of ways to market to a bigger audience, maybe through some of those prisms. I mean, I think certainly the move, even if it was, the goal and the authenticity was creating more DEI in the sport. Yeah. I think what we've done is we've been able to get more voices, more kind of aspects of the culture of our sport and more people involved. I think that, I'm not sure I've answered your question yet, but I think that like one of the problems with trail running has been, it's been too white male dominated. And I don't say that with any kind of axe to grind. I just, the more voices, the more people we can get involved, the better we'll be. Right. And I say that because I've been involved with track and field, which is completely diverse, both domestically and internationally. And that's been great. And one of the things about the globalization of the sport and my experience being races at different places around the world is you see much more diversity in the sport. So backing up to your question, I think that's one of the ways we can get, certainly deeper and wider in the sport. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Well, no, it's okay. And you said a lot of interesting stuff there. One of the things you mentioned was we've had this pivot within these shoe brands from a traditional running sports marketer to hiring in talent from perhaps other industries with other more generalized marketing experience. Has that generally been a net positive in your opinion?
I think so. I think initially, like there was, I saw it more initially from the road, marathon, and track side, where all of a sudden like there was drastic shifts in how brands were interacting with athletes, with running clubs, and things like that. I think overall, I think we've seen a lot more stories come out, a lot kind of different aspects of the sport, ways to understand how people run, how people, hopefully can feel connection to trail running than we ever had before.
I've heard a lot of athletes both celebrate and lament the fact that to be a sponsored athlete in this sport, it's moving away from a meritocracy in the sense that, like, if you win races, you're going to be rewarded more towards how well can you build an audience, what's your reach on social media, et cetera. Do you think that that's been one of the biggest impacts of this new generation of marketers at Shoe Brands?
Absolutely. I think it's a very much a touch point of what's happening both in our sport and then also, society wide. I think that, and a resolution to that is not out there yet. Meaning, like, 5 or 10 years ago, if you were winning even mid-level races and then maybe placing top 10 at Western or something like that, you had this cred behind you that you were a good runner and then you could represent a brand. And rightfully so. The difference is now social media has become such a big part of this, right? And the optics on an athlete's own voice and own brand is as big as ever and is as big as other outlets, And I think that two things have happened. One is people have gotten obviously more into telling the bigger story of an athlete. It's not just the race result. It's like who that athlete is, what they can represent for the brand, meaning what else they're involved in, what they do aside from running, I think is a big part of what this is all about. I think you see that in other sports too. You start to learn more in bigger picture media about what a soccer player does, who they are, and what a football player does. I think that's important. I think it's important for all of us. And the other thing is certainly too, where the interest in the brands are going, again, to get more diverse, to get a wider range of things. And so I know there's been a lot of change in that focus of what an elite team, a sponsored team is all about.
Yeah.
And so you need to do more than just run and have results. You need to have results and expose your personality, which is either not easy for some athletes or, for lack of a better thing. I mean, like, I know there's, again, a lot of white bros out there that are running races and doing really well, but that they feel squeezed out. And I sense that. And there's an aspect of it that's very unfortunate too. I mean, I think we're moving forward and we're evolving, but there's plenty of growing pains tied to that.
Well, one of the questions I have based off that, and this was actually, it's interesting because it was brought up in one of our recent podcast episodes. One of our guest hosts, Dan Kurtz, posed the question, when you think about all the changing forces in the sponsorship landscape, will we be able to preserve performance and athletic excellence through this context? Will there be room for, like, the Galen Rupp type athlete who their only job is to realize how good of an athlete they can be, raise the bar for performances? Are we going to enter into this era, I think he wondered, and I guess I'm wondering too, where there may be, I don't want to say a lull in breakthroughs, but maybe the performances in the sport will be kind of flatlining as there's more of an emphasis on relatability and building audience and stuff like that.
So I think what we're getting at here is there's a two distinct kind of lines or vectors maybe of the sport. One of which is certainly we're at a point where there's more competitive athletes at the front of the pack than ever before, which is great. There's obviously a much younger, faster kind of athlete, men and women leading the charge. If you look at 20 years ago, there was a lot of grizzly, like 40-year-old men like winning races, and they were great athletes. But the sport has changed. Obviously, it's gotten younger. Hopefully, we'll get more women still and be more competitive on both sides like that. But there's that, which is very real. And I think and the globalization has really kind of pushed that, as well as increased interest in brands. But I think the other side is that like, as what happened with marathoning, probably back in the 90s with Oprah and continuing now so with a lot of, for lack of a better word, hobby joggers. And I say that, gracefully, meaning like there's something wrong with hobby jogging. It's like there's elite athletes and there's everyone else who does the sport, right?
Right.
And there's a place for that because that's the bigger part of the pie, right? And that also means there's more money there too. There's more eyeballs there. And so, it used to be for a long time, it was like, oh, I finished my first marathon thing, or I did team in training. And now it's a whole different level. It's a whole different nuanced level of, thousands of Instagrammers and YouTubers talking about, they're very, authentic, but middle of the pack existence. Right. And that's certainly happening in trail running in some respects. I don't think we're going to go away from a point anytime soon where it's going to become less competitive. I really think that the bigger challenge to that is access to certain races. Like I would love to see the top 50 elite athletes in Western every year, right? That would be amazing, right? Because people would focus on it, right? Not the people who can get in, and same with Hard Rock or UTMB. I mean, I would love to see the ability to get those athletes who want to be there, who are primed to race there, to be there, and like, wow, you'd really see racing go forward then, you know. But aside from that, I don't think we're gonna lose the competitive edge yet. I mean, like, or anytime in the future. I think there's enough athletes, there's enough brands, there's enough cool races, and there's more exposure that are certainly all incentives for that.
Just to maybe get some final clarity on it, do you think that this is anything to worry about, where 5 or 10 years down the road, we're going to find people that are excellent cream of the crop athletes, but they have no interest or skill set in playing the social media game, being left out of the system and without the financial support that they need to do what they do because of the changing forces?
I mean, I think that's already happening for sure. I think, again, I think that's more of a bigger societal thing than anything else than it is with the sport. I think that certainly there, you know, again, back to one of my comments, we are a smaller sport than we think. So there's maybe only so many places right now near the top of the podium of who we think is great. You know, we can look at Courtney, we can look at Jim, we can look at Killian, and are there more athletes like that or close to it? Yeah, actually there are. Do they have the exposure from a brand or the money or the ability to make a living at it? Not yet. I mean, so I understand your point. Yeah, that maybe there is a concern. I think that certainly there's going to be an ebb and flow of that. So we're already to the point where there's more, again, middle of the packers they're making a scene, right? Whether or not the marketing money should be going to those people or not, I don't know. It's hard to say. I think there still is opportunity for growth with elite athletes, but this gets back to one of my things too, that like when people complain about the professionalization of sport or even the commercialization of the sport, which I heard Caleb talk about. Yeah. Without those things happening, without the growth and the rise of both the globalization of the sport and things like UTMB, we wouldn't have had the growth. We wouldn't have had the athletes emerge. Most trail runners, let's face it, are working probably a part-time job somehow, or at least maybe full-time, right? Yeah. At least, or dirt bagging it, right? Is that a sustainable model? I don't know. I mean, like, people run trails for the passion of it and being outdoors, which is inherently different than what people do, you know, in the marathon. But there's got to be some sustainable kind of method of supporting these athletes, and it's tough because, yeah, you have Courtney and Jim and a handful of people, but it's not going to be possible for most people. Even a lot of people that are sponsored are getting, you know, $5,000, $10,000, and, you know, maybe some travel perks, things like that. But it's a hard way to make a living when the sport is very international now.
So if you think about what it's going to take, if it's ever going to happen, for our sport to transcend the small bubble we exist in, and I mean, I don't think everybody wants this to happen. I certainly do. For it to break into the mainstream, do we really need top athletes to readily assume this role of being like a social media missionary, or are there other ways, in your opinion, for this to be possible?
I think there's other ways. I think that certainly, I actually think that the marketing to the masses that we've just talked about, whether it be through influencers or social media, is actually going to help the bigger picture. I think there's you know, more stunning ways. I think that if we see a ESPN 30 and 30 show on a trail running race, right, that could be a big thing. If somehow, like I said, the ABC Wide World of Sports was a big thing in the past. If there's a modern equivalent of that, that could be great. I mean, if trail running somehow was an Olympic level sport, that could be a good thing too. These are all things that might seem distant right now, but I think that certainly getting more eyeballs on the sport are going to help. And so again, the person who's a runner, the person who's a trail runner casually, probably can't relate right now. And that's why the bigger kind of sponsors maybe aren't there yet, or TV coverage isn't there. We have great coverage, but those inside the sport are, I got to log into Twitter, I got to see what's happening in a race, right? That's not what most people are doing, and that's not true visibility to the rest of this huge running population. If you look at numbers, I mean, they're inflated perhaps, but like, let's say there's 20 million trail runners in the world. I think on any given UTMB or Western weekend, there's probably 100,000 people that are really kind of keyed into it, right? But we can grow that number, and that growing that number will certainly be a key part of this whole thing.
Do you think that the gear companies that sponsor athletes have more, less, or the same amount of money than they've ever had to put behind these athletes to help them with their social media, to spread the content, et cetera? Like where are we at in like the historical, the history of just how much budget there is to promote this sport and to promote these athletes?
That's a really good question. I think there's, we're only really like maybe 5 or 7 years into really a lot of brands being involved in trail running. I think that, for years it was Salomon, was a primary brand. Hoka obviously has been in since its existence. Other brands have dabbled in it, but in terms of actually really investing in brands, athletes, the Adi Terex team has been really great in the last several years. We need more of those brands to start that and get more like truly involved. I think that, whether their focus is athletes or kind of mainstream that maybe remains to be seen. But I think that certainly getting more brands fully invested. I mean, like there's a brand like Nike, which is the biggest brand in our sport, but they're not really in our sport, right? They have the Nike Trail Team, and I love what they've had over the last 7 years. But we all know the history of that. Like they haven't put a lot of money into it, right? They could if they wanted to. They've advanced their trail running shoes, and they've had top level athletes competing, but Nike obviously knows their business matters more than I do. And like they sell a lot more road running shoes or basketball shoes or whatever. And so my point with all that is if Nike were fully invested, meaning if Nike believed it was a sport that they wanted to grow into, that could be a big thing as well. So right now Hoka is a huge company. Even aside from the Deckers piece, I mean, Hoka's grown enormously, right? Salomon's still a huge company. There's a lot of big brands or fairly big brands that certainly could do more to invest in trail running. And I think that we're going to see some of that. I don't know to what degree. I mean, road marathoning is still a bigger part of the sport than what trail running is. But I think that, for example, last year at UTMB, there was more executives from running brands than ever before, right? Typically it was the 3 or 4 core brands. And like, Jim Weber from Brooks was there. And he literally said, Brian, he's like, trail running's our future. And I'm like, that's amazing, and then Merrill was there. Like all these brands that weren't maybe necessarily thought of as his primary trail running brands were there, So that's a good thing, I think. As to what that leads to in terms of budgetary decisions, remains to be seen. But I think there's more money probably flowing into the sport than ever before. Do we see, again, getting back to Galen Rupp, he's an exception because he's maybe the Courtney or the Killian of our sport. But there's plenty of other track and road marathoners that are making a real living, a full-time living, that aren't working part-time jobs, not only for Nike, but for just about every brand. Right. And so at some point, is the equivalent of making of a guy running a 2:12, 2:10 marathon or faster going to be on par with an ultra runner who's doing great things in 100-mile runs? I don't know. I mean, certainly I hope that that balance, shifts or becomes more equitable toward trail runners for sure. I think that I think Hoka's spending a lot of money in athlete sponsorship. I think that certainly Sportiva seems to be. Salomon, as to how much, I don't know. We all certainly want more. We want more athletes to have these opportunities. So, I'm optimistic, but I totally get the point that it's still not what road and track are.
It's so cool to hear that at UTMB this past year there were more sports marketing execs there than ever before. And I want to key in on what you said about Jim Weber remarking that trail running is the future at Brooks. When you hear something like that, when you hear such a strong statement like that, do you anticipate the pivot to happen like a decade from now? Or are we talking a couple of years? And does it mean like overnight, like if it was 85% road, 15% trail, it's now like 65% trail, 35% road there? Like, how do you interpret that statement?
I think it is tied to shoe sales and like kind of exposure. I think that, however we want to interpret the post-COVID boom in trail running, I think we're still seeing like the results of that. I think that a brand like Brooks, which is widely mainstream and like certainly tied to road marathoning and casual running, I think that if they do get more into trail running, and they have, their trail team has been been growing in a couple different ways. They certainly have some athletes. They also have a wider range of kind of in the sport influencers to some extent. But I think that if Brooks, for example, gets more into it, I think that would be a huge thing. Probably more than like a Skechers. Skechers is a huge brand too, probably number 2 to Nike in terms of overall dollars. But I think that like Skechers isn't as close to the sport, even though they tried to get into trail running and performance running, and they've actually made some really good shoes. I think a brand like Brooks, aside from my point about Nike a minute ago, I think a brand like Brooks could be one of those catalysts to bigger growth overall. I think they have the pulse of their audience is more tied to people that, wow, we should get into trail running, right? And if they do, and hopefully they do, hopefully we're seeing that. I mean, I know they put out a whole new line of trail running gear that's much more authentic than previously. That's going to be a good thing.
Certainly, without knowing all the facts, what's your thesis on why Nike hasn't invested more in our scene?
Aside from the current backlash against Nike, Nike is a company, certainly does what they want. I mean, like they were into hockey for a while, so they bought Bauer, right? And then now they're out of hockey, right? They were into snowboarding for a while, then they're out of snowboarding. I think Nike is certainly true and authentic to running and track and field and marathoning for sure. Are they true to all aspects of running? I mean, like it's hard to say. I mean, like you could pick through kind of how they sponsor USATF or whatever else. But as far as trail running goes, I think that certainly they felt like they should be involved. And for years they had Nike ACG making trail shoes, and they had Nike Running making trail shoes, and that was always kind of a discordant thing because there was a little bit of confusion from their own brands. But I think certainly if they see trail running to be a brand or a part of the sport that's blowing up, they'd be certainly more in it, right? So maybe that cautions all of us to say, oh, maybe we're not as big as we think we are. And I'm only saying that from a Nike bigger world population, because I'm not sure maybe we want that bigger scope of having trail running shoes at your local mall, right? If local malls still existed. But I think that like certainly Nike has been interested enough to be in it, with a small but authentic way. I think that they probably don't see the dollars coming out of it relative to their audiences that they do in a Nike Pegasus or a Nike Air Force shoes. I think that there's certainly bottom line considerations that made them as big as they are, right? And maybe we're always tied to that, when they were founded.
You mentioned Caleb Efta earlier. Caleb is the race director for the High Lonesome 100. We had him on the pod back in late January, and we spent a lot of the discussion talking about that race's relationship to UTMB and Ironman, and just generally his thoughts on the increasing professionalization, commercialization of the sport. And I guess my question, because you referenced the Caleb, so I figured you listened to the episode. Do you think that professionalization necessarily pulls this sport away from its organic roots? Are those scenarios mutually exclusive? Like, what are your thoughts there?
Yes and no. I think that I love what Caleb's doing with his races, and I love the points he's making. I think that my stance has always been that there's definitely a place for both of these aspects in the sport, and there's a necessary there's a need for things, right? I mean, I spent a lot of time in Leadville, and I'm friends with Courtney, and I see, Courtney from a bigger picture view, right? She's obviously a highly sponsored, well-paid and well-deservingly paid athlete who wins a lot of races and is the top ultra runner, female ultra runner sport. And very authentically, watching her train and knowing what she does, like that's totally grassroots, right? I mean, she's as salt of the earth as anybody is, right? Yeah. And so I think that from that point of view, or from the point of view of even Caleb's races, right? I think that there's a place for that. There's a need for that, and runners will aspire to that. And there's also a place and a need for the bigger aspects of the sport we've been talking about. I think you can call it money, you can call it globalization, you can call it commercialization, but I think that if we want our sport to continue growing, and I take that from a perspective of the 1990s to where it is now, there's got to be room for both. There will always be an allure and a draw, a keen sense of authenticity tied to running trails, right? And I know people complain about UTMB being too big and everything else, and I get that. I've seen that grow. But what I tell people in Chamonix is that the authenticity is always going to be there, because each and every runner who toes the line of any one of those races, from the PTL to TDS to UTMB to even the new 15K, is the authenticity comes in the grassroots aspects, comes from running those trails and committing to running those trails, meaning trained to be there and all that stuff. None of those races are remotely easy or mellow or run of the mill or middle of the pack. They're all hard. I mean, like, they're all hard because of, it's man versus man versus environment, or woman versus woman versus environment. And that is, I mean, like, if everything went away Chamonix weekend and people still raced, that's where the authenticity would be, right? And so the sport, when you see the elite athletes, the sponsored athletes coming into all the pomp and circumstance in Chamonix, that's where the money is, certainly. But at the same time, what's just as important, which is just as moving, is 46 hours later, when the stragglers are coming in and they're picking up their kids and their baby, and they're running in, they're crying and they're sobbing. That's what the authenticity, and tied to the grassroots aspects of the sport, is always going to be there, right? And so, again, Caleb's races or your local race that nobody has ever heard about, people aspiring to run 20K, 50K on trails, is tied to all this thing that's always going to be there.
What do you think are the most valid concerns from the folks who are so vocally concerned about growth and increasing injection of money and corporate influence into the sport?
I think that probably, certainly having too many hands in the pot, like too many agendas, too many goals, certainly that get away from the authenticity we just spoke about, is always tough, right? I think that if you look at any sport, if you probably looked at the 1950s NBA or NFL, it was probably not remotely what it is now, right? And now the NBA, the NFL are corporations with crazy amounts of money and crazy amounts of agenda and political power, all these things. Is the NFL and NBA better or worse than it was? It's hard to say, but certainly that's what growth brings, right? There's an aspect of it that is always going to be kind of changing, right? Evolving. I've heard for years, for 20 years or more, about how trail running has had growing pains. And I understand it. I get it, and we could pick 4 or 5 things and say, okay, this has changed, and that, but I think that's just the evolution of a lot of things. One of which is those of us that have been close to the sport, or those of us that are close to the sport now, we love this sport, right? For what? The community, for that connection to the environment, for challenging yourself, for being outdoors, for everything that road running is not. The more we talk about these things, the more we write and blog and podcast about these things, we're getting more people interested, right? And getting more people interested is a great thing, right? But it's also part of the growth too, right? That's leading to the growth, So it's a little bit of a chicken the egg or catch-22, in that we're not going to keep it a private, small grassroots thing forever, even though a lot of our races are limited by that. We've all shared our passion, and the people before us shared their passion to make this sport what it is. And that's what the community, I think, is always doing. The beauty is, even though the community has maybe gotten bigger and maybe kind of rough around the fringes, it's that community that's always drawing us in. So, I'm definitely not an UTMB apologist. I'm not like growth for growth's sake, but I do think that growth is important. And with growth, comes money, exposure, sponsorship, in ways that can be beneficial, and in ways that, bring more growing pains. I think that we wouldn't have Killian without the massive effort that Solomon put behind him, 2009, 2010, 2011. We wouldn't have Courtney right now. We wouldn't have Jim Walmsley right now without those brands behind them, allowing them to be able to do all these things and travel more. I mean, Courtney was a school teacher, right? And certainly her sponsorship has helped her, become this professional runner, and then truly excel in the sport and really push the envelope, and then draw more eyeballs and interest, hopefully getting more women in the sport and more people in the sport overall. But without all this growth, without this money, without this sponsorship, you wouldn't have all this, right? And so again, I love what Caleb and other small races are doing, or race directors are doing, because that's crucially important to, putting on quality events. But there's room for both.
I think it's a really important. I think it's a really important point what you said there about Killian and how he interfaced with Solomon between 2009 and 2011, even beyond that. That it's a very synchronous, symbiotic relationship. Like, yes, Killian is Killian, but without the resources behind him, without the storytelling, the narrative, all that kind of stuff, maybe he doesn't have exactly the same reach as he does today. I may have asked this earlier in the conversation, so I apologize, but just to confirm, do you see the same level of singular investment behind particular athletes in this era? Like, is there anybody in 2023 that comes to mind that's getting the same amount of resources to get their narrative out there, their content out there, like Killian was in 2011, like Courtney was out the gates in 2018?
That's a good question. I think, backing up to the Killian situation, Killian was always, in my opinion, vastly underpaid from what Solomon was doing. He was paid well, but compared to what you would think he's worth, he was never getting paid that much money. I think that certainly all the video stories, trail running TV, which was, certainly an outlier that really kind of helped push content in a lot of ways, was important. And his exposure, obviously, the fact that he was able to leave a year and a half ago, leave Solomon and kind of start his new thing, was partly because that he became that big of a brand to himself, right? And both authentically speaking, meaning he's all that, and like the more you get to know Killian, the more you realize that he would exist without all this stuff, right? And so he's as real as it gets, and you're starting to see that with what he's doing with Normal and a lot of his environmental movement, and even being a big part of the Pro Trail Runners Association, which is actually a cool part of kind of what's happening now in the sport. But I think that, certainly there are athletes that are getting well sponsored. I mean, like, Walmsley, obviously, with Hoka, and Courtney, we could bring them up with Solomon. Are there others that are like that? There's a lot of other athletes that are probably now getting enough money to work, much less on the side or not at all, but, I think part of that is bringing personalities forward too. I think that, like, I've written a lot about Allie Mack in the last year, one, because she's won a lot of races and had a great year last year, right? She ran out of her mind, and she's always been that good of a runner, but she obviously, everything came together. And, but she's also a personality, right? She skydives, she's been base jumping recently. She does all this cool stuff, and she's very much a personality, right? And so that's somewhere where we talked about before about, like, is money going to athletes on a meritocracy basis? For her it is, but also because she's a personality, right? So to answer your question, are there as many athletes being invested in on that level? There could be more, for sure. I would love to see more athletes, both getting the salary, so to speak, the stipend, so to speak, to be that full-time athlete, but also, certainly more brands doing content that is really tied to the front-end competitiveness of the sport.
Coming back to UTMB just for a second, I know if you historically look at our sport, there have been moments in time where a particular race meant a lot to professional sub-elite athletes, and then something happened in the landscape and another race became important. When you look at what our current environment is in 2023, how locked in do you think this current landscape is for the next 5 or 10 years? Like, can you imagine a scenario where there's quote unquote regime change and, like, Western states and UTMB are no longer the focal points, and something like, for example, the World Trail Championships becomes a really big deal and everyone devotes resources and time and their schedules to that?
It's hard to say. I mean, there's certainly a lot of brands that are tied to certain, like, certainly Hoka tied to UTMB, Solomon tied to Golden Trail. I think Western States, for sure has been its own thing as a competitive race for years. Spartan obviously is getting into or interested in trail. I think that, like, when things like that happen, when Spartan, which is a different kind of entity all in itself, can bring in either other eyeballs, other ways of doing things, more exposure, I think that's where you'll see change happen, right? I think that if all of a sudden, like, say Solomon had an opportunity to do this new thing, right? And they've done kind of that new thing with Golden Trail, but that's where you'll see change. I mean, like if Nike was pitched by this a new concept made for TV trail running, right? That's where you see change. I think we'll see slow change. Other than that, I think that there's plenty of growing pains though that are kind of still hindering kind of what the exposure can be for a race and the opportunities for athletes like Hard Rock. Hard Rock, I've never been a huge fan of from the point of view that it's always been this old boys network, right? And like a private race on what essentially is public resources, public land, and everything else. And so, and maybe that's why Hard Rock has both gotten a little bit more flack that they should have, but also hasn't grown. I know that their current race size is 140. I think their permit allows for more than that, but they've kept it small for their own reasons. That I think is more of a hindrance to our sport than anything else. Meaning that like their exclusionary tactics have kind of it's kind of dulled the world of what that is. Yeah, it's a great course and it's an amazing place, but it's also like it's a hindrance to what the sport could be. I think the Western states, we know they're limited to 369 runners and everything else, and there's many different ways that runners are qualifying to get in, which I think is great. I also think that like there's again much more of an opportunity to make that a faster race. But that's not tied to the charter and what the race is all about, too. So if there would become a race, and right now it seems to be UTMB and Golden Trail that really brings these people, and maybe the World Championships, that could be a game shifter. A couple of years ago, the guys in Virginia did the Race of Champions, and I think that had some merit to it, meaning like they wanted to get all these top champion trail runners from around the country and presumably around the world to be at one race, right? And I think the North Face 50 was that for a while too, which I thought was great. So we've already seen some of that change happening for sure. I think the lack of the North Face 50 has been a bummer because that was a great place where a lot of people went. And again, to me, from the competitive point of these races, the more you can allow, more faster elite athletes into the races, the better the sport will be from a competition point of view, right? We know that the Boston Marathon and New York City Marathon limit and curate their elite race fields, right? So it doesn't happen anywhere else except for maybe the World Championships and the Olympics where you really have top competition. But I think the more our sport can do that, the better, at certain key races. And maybe that will be a factor that if talking about change, where brands go or where athletes go, it's going to be kind of one and the same, like if there's an opportunity. So if the World Athletics getting behind the World Championships that happened in Thailand last year and I think are in Austria this year, I think that could gain some traction. I don't think it's going to take away from the main focus that we've talked about of Golden Trail, Western, and UTMB just yet.
You mentioned Hard Rock there, and for such a small race with a relatively small elite field as well each year, it gets pretty outsized media attention, and it makes me wonder, and I'm curious to get your take here, what role does the trail running media play in influencing which events are important and potentially even driving the direction of an entire generation of athletes to participate in?
Yeah, I think that when you saw the boom of Hard Rock, especially in the last 20 years, it went from a tiny race. I think in 2000 they had maybe 80 runners, whatever else, to when you saw like more high profile runners when Jurek and when Carl started running there, and at the same time the advent of I Run Far, social media, obviously in the last 10 years, certainly that's been a perfect storm of like, wow, Hard Rock is this amazing course and storytelling and everything else, and it truly is. And I think that certainly was a factor of those things happening. It was right there, right then when it was going on, when all those things started up. I think that, UTMB has been that as well. I mean, no one really in America knew what UTMB was much until, maybe after the 5 or 6 races that happened, even though, Chrissy had won 2 of those and a bunch of American women had done really well. But I think part of that was, again, the globalization of the sport, the media, kind of niche media, I Run Far, different Instagram, all these things coming up at the same time, then realize, okay, wow, there's a lot of athletes going there. So I think that it's now a perfect storm tied to all these things where where there's going to be focus and exposure. I mean, like, could there be a race in a 100-mile race in Montana that's super authentic and super cool, and a handful of athletes go to that becomes a thing? I mean, well, I guess the rut has already done that, right? But I guess the magnitude of coverage and exposure are tied to all these things now, right? Where the sponsors are, where the athletes are going, where the prize money is, maybe. So I think that's going to be largely tied to that. I think that, Hard Rock hasn't grown or can't grow, right? There's still people that want to do it, maybe for the grassroots element that Caleb's talking about, right? But in terms of exposure and getting, quote, bigger, it's going to take those other elements to make it happen.
It's just such a fascinating thought experiment to me. Like, let's just, and this is a mega hypothetical, but let's just say that in 2024, Free Trail is like, you know what, we're going to send all of our camera people to High Lonesome. Air Viper Running is like, you know what, we're going to take all of our live stream equipment and our drone operators, we're going to send them to High Lonesome. I Run Far, Brian and Megan, we're going to High Lonesome. And because they're at High Lonesome, they're no longer at Hard Rock. Hard Rock is, there's, they go media dark, and High Lonesome's got the whole spotlight. How much does that drive future registrations to that event, and particularly future elite registrations? And then what happens to Hard Rock as a result? Like, I think about that a lot, and I'm wondering if you have any thoughts there.
Yeah, I think that I think that's already happened. I think, obviously Caleb's already got a waiting list. So from the pure grassroots element, without much exposure, without much media exposure, even before, the discussions that have happened in January, I think that, Caleb's done a good job of, one, creating quality races that are good for runners, with well supported, good courses, things like that, safe, things like that, which are important. It's a very baseline of an event. And then I think that reputation has certainly earned him a lot of cred within the sport. And then certainly it's gotten people to go there and want to do those events. So if you're saying if all these media and all this attention went to them, it would go gangbusters. I mean, I think we saw that with Leadville, for better or for worse. Leadville was a relatively small race, 20 years ago, and then got much bigger. Certainly Lifetime got into it, and Lifetime has its own marketing kind of arm, and they both tried to blow it up bigger to maybe 1,000 runners, but they did it based on demand, because they immediately, when they tried to increase it, they immediately got the result. So the challenge is always going to be, how big can your field size be relative to the course and the environment and public safety and resources, and so we're always going to be limited by that in the United States because of land agencies and, being in the backcountry. I think that's people in Europe don't understand, like, oh, why is this, race so small in America? And it's like, they just don't understand, right? Because there's while UTMB is the biggest, there's plenty of big races over there that trail races, the Sierras and all is very, I don't know what the numbers are, but it's very big. But it's just different, compared to what the possibilities are here in America. And that goes true for, Southeast Asia and just about everywhere else in the world. So backing up to that, I mean, like, if High Lonesome got all this attention, yeah, it would be this, maybe there's a couple hundred entries, and then there's, 10,000 people that want to apply. That's both a good problem and a very bad problem to have.
I mean, I just think too about the North Face Endurance Challenge series, how that went away, and particularly the race in the Marin Headlands every November, early December. And I'm pretty sure, I mean, Spartan effectively, they replaced that with their whole Golden Gate Classic series. But I mean, for all intents and purposes, to runners in sport, it kind of dropped off the face of the earth in terms of competitive importance and media attention. So
yeah, that's unfortunate. And Spartan did try to take that over. And there's taking it over and having an event that serviceable event in that venue, but it just showed that there was a buzz with the North Face 50 that drew runners there. That was, and I think that got back to the competition of it. People wanted to go there to race it and like see where they stacked up. And I think that was a beautiful thing for the sport that really kind of in this most recent growth period was an important part of the sport too, certainly, and that it played a role, even though North Face, for maybe marketing or dollar reasons, didn't want to do it anymore. It was super important for the sport to where we are now.
And you acknowledged it a minute ago, and I should probably acknowledge it here too. All of these races, High Lonesome, probably even the Golden Gate series, they're having no trouble driving registrants to their races. We're talking exclusively here about sort of the competitive fluidity of the sport and what happens when, media puts a spotlight on it and which way athletes go as a result. But yeah, super interesting. I want to ask you a couple more questions about the professionalization of the sport. We've been talking a bit about Courtney and Killian. Eric Schranz from Ultrarunner Pod has a weekly newsletter. He had a really good question in there in today's edition. It was around whether we think it's good for one athlete to dominate in the sport, or if it's better to have competitive parity and more of a mystery around the results of each event. Obviously, anytime Courtney's in a race, she's the odds-on favorite to win. Killian, in most circumstances, with a few exceptions, similar. What are your thoughts there? Do you think from a fan standpoint, it's better to have mystery or to be in awe of this one person just having their way in the sport?
That's interesting. Obviously, I mean, we've kind of come of age in the last 10 years having Killian be so dominant, right? And yet he's human. He's lost races before, and at the same time, he's still very good, which is, kind of a testament to him being this generational talent, right? Which is great. And same with Courtney too. I think that hopefully their performances and who they are and their exposure only inspires more people to come into the sport, right? I think that's the goal. I think that's probably happening. I think that, again, tied to other opportunities that might be out there. All these things are, again, working in somewhat unison to create a deeper level of competitiveness in the sport. I mean, again, it's kind of which came first, right? I mean, like they kind of came of age all at the same time and had this thing, but at the same time, there's deeper, more competitive fields in most of these marquee races we're talking about than ever before. If you look at the competitive level of even maybe Western states or like, a trail race in 2000, that was a thing. I mean, like Pikes Peak, you'd have one or two athletes that were competitive and were doing a lot of races. Now you have, not only are these races a lot deeper in the field, but also you just have more known, named trail runners, I think that's good. So would I love to see, somebody come up and challenge Courtney? Absolutely. I think it'd be great for everybody, including Courtney, I think that last year's UTMB was pretty compelling because unlike 2017, when it didn't go as well as it did last year, I think when having Walmsley and Killian both competing deep into the race is great for the sport, right?
Yes.
At some point, we're not going to see Killian win every race, right? Not because he's aging out, but because eventually there'll be more people that run well. But he's also a master of the craft, right? And there's probably other sports, Michael Jordan in basketball or Tom Brady maybe in football that have both dominated a sport, but have also inspired the rest of the athletes or the league or whatever to rise up as well.
And for your personal preference, do you want to see more mystery in the sport, or do you like seeing these displays of otherworldly excellence?
Well, I think, a common term that's been kicked around in your pod is random ballers and everything else. And I think that random ballers is a cool concept, although I think that speaks to two things. One, first of all, I think that's great when people come out of the woodwork. I mean, I remember, it's like, I just think that when Hayden, came up, all of a sudden, who's Hayden Tonks, and he became this great athlete right away. I think that's good for the sport. I think it's good for competitiveness. I think it's good for, interest overall. But I also think that the random baller concept was still tied to the fact that we were a smaller sport, maybe still are, compared to what we could be. Again, if we had more athletes, full-time athletes getting paid full-time to run, to race, we'd see more athletes at that level. So I definitely would love to see more intrigue, more mystery, more runners come up out of nowhere. Although I think, one of our talking points offline was about should brands be recruiting athletes out of Kenya?
Yeah.
And that's kind of a, obviously On got burned last year when both of their athletes that won Sierras and all wanted to be, busted for doping. I think that that's a challenge. I think to gratuitously just dig for runners that are fast like that and make them trail runners is not the way to grow the sport. I think the way to grow the sport is authentically developing trail runners within the culture of the sport, within the competitiveness of the sport. I mean, you could take fast elite road runners into snowshoe racing and a lot of different sports and make them fast and maybe make them win. No differently than there was a promoter that tried to bring the Tara Homara from Mexico to Leadville one year, right? I just think that's a little bit awkward and not true to the spirit of the sport. And so I do want to see more competitive athletes come up. It would be great to see, a different winner, maybe not out of nowhere, but certainly rise up. And we've seen that to some extent. If you follow the athletes in the sport, you've seen a lot of athletes rise up to, being fifth at CCC one year and then being podium at UTMB a few years down the road. So I think that that's important to the sport. I love seeing that for sure.
Yeah, you nailed it. One of the questions I wanted to ask you was whether brands and the media in general should be affiliating with athletes in Kenya. Obviously, there was that whole issue with the two winners of Sears and all getting caught. But maybe more broadly, a question I want to ask you to start this particular conversation off is specifically within the ultra trail scene, so 50K and up, particularly 50 mile, 100K, 100 mile. Do you think that we have any semblance of a doping problem in our scene right now?
What define any semblance? I mean, do I think that doping has been around trail running? Absolutely.
Ultra trail running?
Say again?
Ultra trail running?
Oh, sure. I think it's probably just because that's where the more prominence is in race finishes and such. I mean, like, do I think that a doped up runner has gone to a fast, notable 10K in Europe and on the trails and won? Probably, but like I think because of the attention, the exposure, potentially prize money, I think certainly there is doping in trail running, ultra trail running. As to how deep that is, I mean, that's anybody's guess, right? I mean, whether you're a skeptic or an optimist, who knows? I think most of the athletes I've been around, I haven't been aware of anyone. People ask me, early on when I first met Killian and I, had a chance to be around him and run with him in certain things. I would say that like, absolutely not. There's no chance in hell that he's a doper, right? But I think that there's other, here's the thing, the athletes always know, right? In track and field, the athletes always know. And that only means that like performances that come out of nowhere or personality types or whatever else, certainly there was a lot of doping in the 2012 Olympics. The problem with that is, and the problem here too, is the infrastructure of a sport sometimes protects its stars or sometimes protects, or doesn't want to go down that road. Obviously, maybe because of what cycling went through, right? Cycling destroyed itself and it had to clean itself up. I'm not sure that cycling is totally clean now, but certainly, running and track went through a phase, certainly in the 90s where there was a lot of record set and a lot of doping, but the doping keeps advancing is one of the problems, right? And like, if you're working with a biotech company, you can always figure out a way to beat the test, I suppose, right? I mean, Lance is a good example. I mean, he obviously, quote, never got positively tested, but I think the big thing with trail running is that until we have some real structure of uniform testing and specifically out of competition testing, it's the Wild West.
Well, I know in like the track and field world specifically, you have a lot of operators that are around those athletes that are giving them all these resources that effectively bring them right to the edge of what is legal. Do we have that kind of like posse around the top athletes in our sport where they could be experiencing the same thing, where everything that they're doing is legal, but like they have this nutritionist and this coach and this marketing person at this brand, and they're all like in concert working together. And it's like, okay, like if we give you like just enough of like this drug, like you're going to not trip any tests, but it's all going to work out.
I don't think so. I don't think that the systematic structure of trail running is to that point, like you saw with the Tour de France teams, right?
Yeah.
I think that certainly there's concern. I think a bigger concern, and this is a concern that Catherine Paletti had when they were starting UTMB. They were also tied to the Marathon Mont Blanc weekend, and there was agents or coaches bringing Kenyan or Eastern African runners to those races because there was prize money, right? And so one of her concerns was she'd see this check be written to an agent or a coach, and then the athlete get very little of it, right? And so I think, especially in those realms, still in elite marathoning, that there's handlers of people that are in it for different reasons, right? And the challenge with that is that like those athletes wouldn't have those opportunities to go race major marathons or even sub-major marathons, right? Where, they're making prize money that'll change their life for what life is in Kenya or Uganda. But they're making that money. They have an agent or a handler or a coach that's, working for his own interests, and that's where the money goes. Does that happen in trail running? I don't think it's happening blatantly. I think certainly there was some of that maybe last year with the runners at Sierras and all, but overall, I don't think I don't think that structure is there. I think that most of the trail runners we know or we've seen, and we're small enough, we know most of the athletes that they're authentically working and training, of their own selves, right? Does that mean there's not doping in trail running? No, there absolutely is some level of doping in ultra trail running, but it's not systematic yet.
I guess this is a two-part question, but what level of doping, if it was revealed in our sport, would shock you, like in terms of the widespreadness of it?
What level of doping would shock me? I mean, I don't know. I think certainly I would hate to go back through the list of any of our great races, UTMB, Western States, anywhere, and later find out that somebody was doping all along, and then it would eliminate like all this excitement, hype, and credibility that athlete had. But I'm sure that if there was more diligent drug testing, we might have that, right? And there's been rumors about certain athletes, and that's not helpful either. But because there isn't drug testing, you're reliant on rumors, right? And not many rumors, but enough to know, like, okay, maybe something's happening here, right? That does a disservice to the athlete, those results, the sport in general. And so the one thing that out of competition testing, and again, it would have to be universal, would help eliminate that. Does it completely eliminate it? No, but at least it puts a huge barrier that we think mostly works in track now or in marathoning now, that would eliminate that from happening in ultra trail.
A lot of listeners, reasonably, they probably want to pinpoint what causes what in our sport. And when it comes to doping and you think about all the factors involved and the incentives involved, and you had to pick the most important factor, is it the introduction of prize money? Is it more beefed up professional contracts? Is it pride? Is it ego? What do you think typically or most broadly drives the behavior to dope in our sport?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think they always follow the money, right? I mean, I think that certainly there is in any competition, there always is prestige in winning and being the best, right? If you look at the steroid scandal in baseball or the doping, not just recently, but for 100 years in Tour de France, certainly there is the notion of that, right? Because even before the Tour de France probably had any prize money, there was doping, 60, 70, 80 years ago, right? So I think it's a combination of all those things. I think that certainly the growth, the commercialization, the professionalization we've talked about are certainly all going to be parts of this. There's more attention, more focus, more opportunity in trail running, as there was in triathlon. And triathlon has gone through a lot of this too, the same way that cycling has. I think that, but part of that is that's also why we also very much need out of competition drug testing and systematic drug testing that not only the athletes adhere to, but the brands adhere to, the races adhere to, that we're all in unison about this. I think, we're going, head first into this new era, and we're talking about growing pains. Well, the growing pains are really going to be like much bigger if we don't also incorporate drug testing, again, is it a fail-safe program? No, but getting away from, say, a quartz and getting to more, specifically WADA controlled or at least water administered stuff is going to be a big help to eliminate the fear of that or the lure of that.
When you think about who is the most effective or who is the most responsible for creating change in this realm, implementing better controls, testing, all that kind of stuff, is it the athletes? Is it the events? Is it the brands? Who bears the bulk of the responsibility, in your opinion?
Unfortunately, I'm not sure if anybody does. I think, federations are always tough. If you look at this federation of any sport, you've seen like that with World Athletics, there's always like some kind of a side angle and scandal and corruption and everything else with FIFA. I mean, obviously, you can only trust the federation so far. It comes down to the athletes who are going to both gain the most or lose the most, and I think certainly this new organization, the Professional Trail Runners Association, is that thing in our era, in our life, in our sport that's happening. I know they've had their initial conversations with initial meeting a couple of weeks ago with UTMB, which is great. I think that I think there's nuances there too. I think that some of the things we've talked about, some of the things I've written about, some things we've seen in the last year are certainly red flags to where the sport is going. I think that it doesn't mean that it's black and white, meaning here's how the races do things, and here's how the athletes want it. I think there's ways to kind of enlighten both sides and come together. So I think that this organization is going to be key going forward, hopefully as soon as this year, to kind of realigning a lot of things that need to happen. But again, it's the athletes. The athletes have especially in this sport, have the most to gain, but also the most to lose. I mean, like there's no real kind of organization amongst athletes like there is a baseball union or a football player association that can really kind of guide and steer things. If those sports didn't have that, the baseball owners, it would be much different. Like, the money would all be going to the owners to their own agenda. But obviously, as in those sports, as in trail running, the athletes are the talent. And so therefore the athletes, need to, and I'm glad they are organized to be able to have what they want to come true. Right. Otherwise, they could boycott and go away, and the sport would be much less than that, but then new people would fill in. Right. So at this point, it's a crucial part of what's happening in the sport right now, and those meetings and those hopefully discussions will lead to positive change.
I want to ask one question about prize money, because you mentioned a moment ago how important it is to follow the money in the doping scene. We had a guy on the show 2 months ago, Fred Abramowitz, who's the race director for the Run Rabbit Run. Great guy, good thinker around the sport. I'm bringing Fred up. I'm bringing Run Rabbit up because I believe they have the largest prize purse in the American ultra scene. I think it's about $75,000 ballpark. Right. In my humble opinion, despite that carrot in front of professional runners, they don't always recruit the deepest fields. In fact, you see a lot of athletes go to UTMB. I know that they've recently put more prize money on the table, but they go to UTMB, they go to Leadville, et cetera, et cetera. How big of an influence do you think prize money ultimately plays in determining where athletes show up at races?
Yeah, it's an interesting topic for sure. I think, first of all, I love what Run Rabbit does. Their races are great. The courses are amazing and great experiences. And I love what those guys do. They believe in supporting the runners, which I think at its essence is a great thing. They also give a lot of money back to the community and to charities too. So I think on that level, those guys are doing it really well across the board. How much is prize money an incentive? Yeah, I guess the question would be, why aren't more elite runners going to Run Rabbit and chase that money? Yeah, that's a good question, and it's maybe hard to answer. I mean, I think that timing is one of those things. I think certainly when it comes, a few weeks after UTMB, that's a challenge. But maybe not the only reason. Now we have Pikes Peak in September. We have the Mammoth Trail Fest in September, so it's only going to be more challenging, I think, to get runners there. So to that point, maybe prize money isn't that big of a deal. But also knowing that to go there, there's a handful of slots on the podium to get money. Maybe there's other reasons people go other places. Certainly that's a good point. I mean, on the backside of that though, is that in one of my beliefs of why prize money is important, when there's a big race series like UTMB or even Golden Trail, where there's a lot of money in it, a lot of exposure, and a lot of building of a brand for a sponsor or for something else, they should be compensating the athletes because they deserve it, right? Because again, they're the talent, and they can't just be used come in and run our race and we're making all this money on the side. And I have no idea how much any of those races are making, but certainly we know that there's a lot of money in those races, UTMB series, Golden Trail for, two of them. And to give, a tiny amount of prize money seems to be disproportionate to what the athletes are providing, right? The athletes are really making the races, they're making the whole thing. The athletes through the years, the last 20 years of UTMB have made, that what it is. So it's two sides. Do I think what Run Rapid's doing is great? Yeah. Do I think what that UTMB should be definitely paying out more money, which they've done in the last 3 years? Yeah, for sure. But it is an interesting balance. I mean, do athletes go to race UTMB for the money or the prestige of winning, right, or competing, right? I think it's in our sport. I think it's certainly competing, right, which is good, which shows that our sport has integrity and the athletes have integrity. And if you and I decided to create like this really cool big race with $100,000 prize money in Salt Lake City, would we get athletes or not? It's hard to say. But certainly it shows that like the ability to compete authentically is more important.
All right, I'm gonna go buy the domain ultratrailsaltlake.com tomorrow. We're gonna start fundraising for this thing.
I mean, there's that race in Hawaii, the Maui 50, is it? I think
I've heard of this.
They've got $50,000 in it, and I think certainly there's people interested in creating races for racing fake and putting money behind it, and that's how actually a lot of other sports have kind of evolved. And like as you saw, say, golf tournaments over the years put more money in from individual tournaments, right? I mean, the sport grew, and like certainly the PGA grew, and now you have this other tour. But like interest grows from these spikes and things. And again, the North Face 50 was a positive spike, in the early 2000s that drew people or got attention because of the prize money, right? Why it hasn't become the same thing with Run Rabbit, it's hard to say. There's probably several answers to that, but I still think prize money is important at some level to support elite athletes.
I've heard the Sidious Mag folks talk about this a bit in track and field, Michael Johnson as well. I want to ask this question to you in a trail running, ultra running context. Do you think that funneling professionals into less events and more concentrated fields is both better for the athletes and better for the fans of our sport? Or is our current sort of dispersed landscape where people haphazardly pick their schedules and it's not all in concert it's okay?
You mean making more marquee events where the exposure is the brightest?
Yeah, and there's almost like a recycling of race schedules every year in the same way like the NBA and the NFL, it's predictable each year. There's a predictability to where people are going each year, and there's an incentive to go there, and you're guaranteed great fields, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've seen the evolution of like NASCAR and like even golf, coming down to more championship kind of tournaments, I think, which are cool, or championship races. I think, I heard Carl Lewis speak recently and talk about how there should be fewer pro athletes, right? I mean, I think one of the challenges of our sport on any level is that maybe we don't have enough athletes shining the brightest on top, maybe because there's so much effort, resources, money going into the developmental athletes, right? I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, would we all benefit if there was a championship race in December where we knew all the top athletes were going? Probably, yeah. Maybe UTMB is becoming that. I don't know, but I think there's such a disparity of what our races are in this sport, and especially with it growing so much. I think last year there were so many race opportunities for different athletes, both in ultra and sub ultra, that it became exciting, but also almost overwhelming, right? When you saw, Golden Trail happening and then Thailand happening and UTMB and because UTMB offers all these different races, I mean, like there's a lot going on, and it seems to be a little bit all over the place, and everyone's like, at the same time, all keyed up on like, oh, I'm going to do the Western UTMB double, right? And like, I don't know. I mean, to me, I think as an athlete, pulled back from that. Like in Ironman, there was always one race. You go to Kona and race that. That'd be the marquee race. There'd be other races around the time that around the schedule. But I think as athletes, it's probably a little bit more nerve-wracking to have all this kind of imbalance of races, right? I think that there's no one place where you need to be, and maybe no one place where you think you need to be. I don't know. It's hard to say, it's definitely, our sport is still largely unstructured, and like, and there's some good elements to that. And there's, again, the whole grassroots side of things is great, but from a competitive point of view and an identity point of view, again, for that bigger mainstream audience, what's the biggest race? Oh, I read, so-and-so won this race. Oh, is that big? But what about UTMB? What's Golden Trail? I think that there's still an identity crisis because of all that.
If you had to put your forecasting prediction hat on for a second, and we're looking at the sport maybe 25 years down the road, what do you think is going to be the single most different or important change in the sport between 2023 and let's just say 2050? Like, is it structure? Is it consolidation? What do you think?
That's a really good question. I think that we're seeing so much growth in different parts of the world. I think Southeast Asia is completely blowing up, and based on the sheer number of people there, and also the money in the economies there, that's probably going to become a bigger part of the focus. I know Fred talked about like the sport becoming too Eurocentric, and that happened. Actually, it is very Eurocentric now because there was a more established competitive base of races there, 20 years ago where there wasn't here, right? And so we'll see some of that shift continue to happen. I think we'll continue to see it become more global. As for better or for worse, a lot of other sports have. NBA, NFL, they're both trying to have games and exposure in Mexico City, in London, all these places. So I think that some of what we're doing in our sport is already there, but I think that's going to become more of a thing. And so that might mean that Western states, for example, becomes less of a thing or becomes one of a series of events like that around the world where there's prestige and there's history and such tied to that. So I think globalization is going to be the continued globalization, and with it, money, athletes, and such will become the biggest change in that time. I think that in 25 years, certainly there'll be kind of a wider range or wider scorecard of athletes than we've ever even imagined right now.
And from a media context, do you think that there's going to be this one overarching media outlet covering the professional part of the sport, or will we see more regional arms? Like I grew up in the Boston area, so Nesson was big. I would watch the Red Sox on Nesson. I'd listen to WEEI, Red Sox Radio Network on the radio. Like, how do you forecast that all being hashed out?
Well, first of all, we have two passions that we share. So trail running and Red Sox, which is good. I don't know. I think that media is in such a place where, both for general media and then sports specific media, that it's I'm not sure you'll ever have a super dominant scenario anymore. I don't know. I mean, like certainly ESPN is maybe that for more broad-based sports. But as much as you've had like the continued emergence of the New York Times on a digital platform and a social platform, you've had a gazillion other entities pop up too, and like we've seen that in ultra trail, right? I mean, like I actually have a stack of magazines which are now outdated next to me. I mean, like every time I go to Europe, I always pick up different magazines.
Oh,
There's
yeah.
still magazines over there, but we've also seen plenty of great social and digital channels as well. I think Sidious Mag is a good example. We've talked about how you're getting next level evolution of how the sport is covered, but I don't think it'll be maybe just one media entity. I think that because of the popularity, because of the international aspect, we'll continue to see more pop up and more voices too, hopefully more media voices. I think that that's important. I think that, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, maybe we all read Trail Runner magazine and paid attention to I Run Far only. But now there's plenty of places out there we can go that are international spots, international outlets that like you go to on a regular basis because they're tied to the sport too, And I think that like as the NFL has created an NFL Network, the World Marathon Majors has its own podcast and own content. The races themselves or the organization of races will have more content on their own too. So that'll be maybe either competing or complementary to what the sport is already doing, right? I mean, the Boston Red Sox have their own Boston Red Sox reporter that, reports on a daily basis what's happening, but so does Nesson, so does the Boston Globe, for example. So I think we'll continue to see that happen as well. I mean, World Athletics has their own people reporting about track and field, right? As much as there are journalists and podcasters and Instagrammers as well. So I think that we'll continue to see the evolution of that in media as popularity grows, because there's so many stories to be told, and certainly there's plenty of outlets that will allow that to happen.
One last question on this front. I'm curious, based on your experience and what you know, what are some interesting differences between the American trail running media and the European trail running media? Because I know that like there are a lot of folks that will say the athletes in Europe, they might be 5 or 10 years ahead of American athletes in terms of just the way they approach the sport. Is it the same in media, or is there any argument to be made that maybe even the American trail running media is leading the way in terms of content and how we think about things, et cetera?
I think the American trail running media and maybe endurance media has certainly set the tone for other media to follow. I think that it is interesting that the sports, like trail running as a sport, was when I was first over there to do a race and to witness a race. It's like, wow, the sport has really evolved and really advanced compared to what the American scene was. And this is like 2003 or so, and that's probably still the case with the depth of competition and the international. I mean, certainly when you're in Central Europe, it's easy for runners from all over the place to show up there and race that race. Where it was, for a long time, even Western was largely American only fields, But as far as media goes, I think that certainly American media has led things. I mean, I don't think there was. We started Trail Runner magazine in 1999, 2000. There had been a previous magazine in the 90s called Running Wild, but certainly that type of media was American or U.S. focused, U.S. centric, right? For better or for worse. I think certainly when Brian and Megan, when Brian, I guess, started I Run Far, I remember running with him. We were on a trail run in Leadville, and he was like, "Hey, I'm going to quit my lawyer job and start this thing." I'm like, "Oh, that's cool," And certainly that was a big game changer. Big game changer. What's funny was it was a Vask sponsored event. We're trail running and testing some new shoes, and Vask is a brand that's in and out of trail running, but certainly I don't know, Brian's vision, everything else to cover trail running on a more ultra trail running on a more immersed basis was certainly smart. And but I think that was like one of the leaders certainly to start off. I think there's plenty of other brands we could name that have come along and certainly changed. But I think certainly with anything with brands, the reason so many brands have become focused, not just media brands but shoe brands, have become focused on America is because our audience, our numbers are so much bigger. Sportiva is an Italian brand, but they're really concerned and focused on the American market. And Hoka was a French brand that obviously became American centric, just because the opportunity for sales and eyeballs is so much bigger here. That being said, that's what I'm saying. Is Southeast Asia is got so many more eyeballs and so many more dollars, whatever quantity of money you want to call it, than the U.S. market. So that's where I think there could be shifting, both from a media point of view, from a brand point of view, from a race point of view, in the near to 20-year future. But certainly as of right now, even though the sport is Eurocentric in terms of a lot of racing and everything else, there's still an American focus because all those brands, all those races, all those people know that the opportunity is here in the American market still.
To close up this conversation, which has been excellent, by the way, I really, really appreciate your time. I want to talk about how journalists are managing this era of the sport and generally this media climate. First question I have for you, can you talk about the value of being a journalist in this era where athletes effectively can be their own publicists? Schmucks like myself can start a podcast. Social media has sort of reached this zenith. Talk about just your value in the marketplace of content consumption with all of these competing forces.
Yeah, it's totally changed in good ways and awkward ways. But I think that my background, being trained as a journalist, as a traditional journalist, which back in the day was newspapers, has certainly evolved in different ways. But I think that I think that it's been a good thing to see more voices come out, especially athletes come out. I think that when Derek Jeter launched the Players Tribune, right, it gave this voice to all these athletes, and suddenly realized there's a whole different type of content that can come out aside from just journalists and hack writers like myself being able to dispense it, right? Certainly, I love storytelling and I love the sports I've written about, and I will continue to do that. For me, it's never been about me as the story. I've always wanted to be not about me. It's always been the story I can tell. So that suits me well. Still, there's still plenty of opportunities for that. Certainly, when athletes tell their own story, create their own brand, I think there's two good values to that. One, which is obviously you're hearing a really raw, authentic story right from the athlete, which is easier for some athletes to do than others. We know when there's a good version of that, it's like, wow, really compelling. We love that. I think also from the athlete point of view, they've created their own brand and then they've been able to certainly monetize that, hopefully. And then there's the other side of that is where it's also created like this influencer world, which I'm not really sure the jury's out on that yet. And I'm not even sure kind of what it even means, but that's another level of storytelling, obviously, that wasn't there 20 years ago. And so I think backing up to what the role of the journalist is, I mean, like I consider myself a committed journalist to everything I write. And I mostly write about running. I do, also, cover some other sports and stuff like that. But my goal has always been based in the authenticity or the integrity of journalism, which is basically telling hopefully fair stories that are balanced and everything else. Certainly when an athlete tells their own story, they're telling it from one point of view, which again, that's good too. I think in the middle ground, there's the challenge of, which we saw a lot in when the first, when the blogosphere evolved in the early 2000s, people just kind of like wanted to be a writer, right? And they started, you saw then early on, and you still see now where, probably 3/4 of the content on the internet is either false, fictional, or not really great, right? But the beauty of what the internet has done is it's allowed more people to tell more stories, and there's more stories out there. My role is still, there's opportunities for me I can still find, or I still do, which is great. There's plenty of things I turn down that I don't want to do. Like I said, I've never wanted to be that influencer type. It's never been about me. And I rarely share anything on my own about running because it's quite personal to me. But that being said, I think that there's been a benefit from having more voices, more stories told. And at the same time, hopefully there's still a place where like real stories with, especially as the sport gets bigger, with, again, these balanced kind of journalism roots are tied to. I think that's important. I mean, for example, Brian Paul was never a journalist; he was a lawyer, right? And full props to Brian for everything he's done, right?
Yeah,
he's coming at it from a different point of view, and that's been good. I think that's been an example of getting the unfiltered voice of athletes more out in the world, right? And he did it at a time before social media became that thing. So when he was trailside in UTMB or in Silverton, with his mic asking questions, that was part of the evolution too, right? And now you see athletes just doing it on their own on, Instagram Live, Facebook Live, just on the middle of a trail somewhere, just telling a story, which again, it's all been an evolution. And I think we'll continue to see that.
Do you think, like when you look at sports, again, not to beat the drum of basketball and football and ESPN and whatnot, but like you think of people like Jamel Hill and Stephen A. Smith and Bomani Jones and Skip Bayless, all those folks, like they're not only journalists, or they didn't just have these journalistic careers, they also spent a lot of time editorializing and going on these talk shows and commentating and taking on the role of passionate, articulate fan. Do you forecast any era in our sport where that type of journalist will become popular and take shape, and like these talk shows develop and like it's all about the hot take and stuff like that?
I think so. I think that one of the big things that happened in regular sports journalism in the 1990s was people like Stephen A. Smith or people that worked for the Denver Post or the LA Times kind of were moonlighting initially as like for local TV or for ESPN. When ESPN was trying to figure out where their talent was coming from, they'd get these people to, hey, they're already covering the sport, right? Eventually there was pushback between the media brands and they had to become, one or the other, right? And so a lot of those reporters went to ESPN both for on-camera talent, but also for, digital content. And so ESPN really kind of cherry-picked the best sports journalists covering those sports to then cover, sports for ESPN. And with that came a lot of personalities like a Stephen A. Smith, right? And I definitely think there's a place for that in running. I think that like Citius Mag is on the front end of that. I think those guys can be a good mix of funny, of fanboy, of controversial, of real, right? And I think there's definitely a place for that in trail running, although the difference is that trail running is obviously, again, we're smaller than we think, as much as we've grown. And so it wouldn't take much to start that, I think, but certainly getting the audience to really buy into that on a regular basis would be, tough at first, I think. I think that like, I watch a lot of the morning shows in the background on ESPN, Get Up or First Take. And I think that it's kind of good background noise and it keeps me in tune to everything that's happening in the world of sports, which I still love on a regular basis. I'm a big hockey fan. And like, I now that baseball's starting today, I'm stoked about that. But I guess one of my questions, or maybe one of the challenges right now in trail running or in running in general, is like there's so much content out there right now relative to, again, the journalism, the podcast, the athletes, that it's hard to find out which is the best yet, maybe, or maybe there isn't that one dominant brand in a lot of ways. I think there's players that are emerging in our sector of the sport, but I think that there's so much content that, like, probably you and myself get delivered on a regular basis to my inbox, or that I'm aware of. It's just hard to be able to consume it all, right? I consume ESPN because it's a dominant player, and I know where it is, right, on a regular basis. And obviously also there's a very high level of produced content. As much as we see Stephen A. Smith as being like this shouting kind of crazy person, he's actually, the whole shows are really well produced. They have really good takes, and they have really good ability to inspire conversation, right? And that would be the goal too with, I think, Ultra Trail, to be able to, or even track and field or road marathon. I think what Sidious Mag did at the World Championships last year, where they had like kind of these mini live shows, really good. And it takes the expertise of the host and certainly the produced platform of having people with cameras and everything else, and then having to have both serious questions and then easy banter as filler. I think that's when you watch one of those ESPN style talk shows, or even like a CNN or Fox, whatever your choice is, when they have political pundits on.
Crossfire.
Yeah, all those things. We see those in a very smooth production, right? That's actually, there's plenty of pre-planning to all that stuff, to all those shows that goes on to specifically have who you're on, what the script is, who you're going to be. And then it looks like it's kind of just casual talking, right? It's not, and that's what makes it tough. I mean, I think that, like, you probably know as a podcaster, it's not easy to just have flow going, especially when there's more than one guest, right? But I think that like, certainly there's possibility for doing more of that, especially as more topics become maybe more universal or more, hot takes, or, I mean, there's plenty of them right now we've already talked about. But I think that, like, having a produced show like that would be super cool, and I think that because we in the sport, even though we're small, we've gravitated toward cool things, and, like live streaming of races, people like tune in, just as they did to a live Twitter feed, so I think eventually there'd be an audience to grow out of that.
Are there any other, as we're brainstorming right now, are there any other content angles or formats that you enjoy consuming in other arenas that you might like to see imported into our world? ESPN Get Up is a good example. I think one is really good because they have a really good journalist at the helm of that, and then they bring in athletes of different backgrounds, different voices. One of the things that ESPN has done, they've gotten more diverse with their ability to tell stories. It used to be, like Mike and Mike in the morning would be, Mike Greenberg and Mike Golick, two white guys just talking about sports. Okay, the difference now is Mike Greenberg is still involved as a really good seasoned broadcast journalist, but he's bringing in a diverse range of athletes who are in the sport or formerly in the sport. And so I think those kind of things are really a change that I've appreciated, because one, you get, again, more voices always bring in more perspective, and that's always good. And I think, I've learned, as a casual hockey, football, basketball fan, I've learned a lot more, become much more enlightened than I was 20 years ago, just watching SportsCenter or something like that, and I think that, like, if that can happen in running, all the better. We're already a super diverse sport on a global scale. Like I said, one of the things that is limiting ultra trail right now in America is that it's mostly male and white still, and there's probably a whole different, range of conversations we could have some other day about that. But I think that, maybe even starting from the media / content part of that, you could start to have that change by bringing in more voices, So there's plenty of other ways. I always appreciate hearing more directly from athletes, but I also as a journalist and a fan of journalism, I appreciate when, like, the New York Times tells a story in our realm, either specifically in trail ultra or in marathon or endurance sports, because it really brings out, again, a deeper dive from a journalistic point of view. When I think recently, obviously, New York Times has covered Barkley, they've covered Ironman's change, all that stuff. And it's always good to hear kind of a really kind of balanced, unbiased, like complete, like, and even like pulled back from the sport ability to tell a story. Last question. And for context, so we're about 100 minutes into this conversation, and the analytics tell me that 85% of the people that started this episode will finish it, which actually gives me a lot of faith in the attention spans of humans out there, even in this era. But I think most people would say we're in this era of diminishing attention spans. And I'm wondering, given that climate, do you feel pressure to write about certain topics at the expense of others? Or do you feel like you have the freedom to put pen to paper on whatever is interesting you in a given moment, and the format doesn't matter, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, it's interesting. As social media and clicks became a thing, likes became a thing. When I was at Competitor Group, which is, another company that, talk about money and talk about, Competitor Group is a company that was started by private equity and kind of organized all these endurance athlete events and media. But out of it came, I think, my role was to create good content. I think there was an evolution there. So aside from that, though, there was also like this increase of brand marketers who were concerned mostly with clicks, right? And one of the reasons that the print model of magazines, which I think consumers still might like at some level, like The Wind is a good example of a great modern print magazine. Yeah. But I think that the business model has taken it away because obviously these marketers want to have a direct understanding of kind of the analytics of how their either ads are performing or how the audience is engaging. And so I think that I think there, yeah. So there's two challenges. One, there's definitely a less immersed or maybe less long-term attention span. I think that we're all, swiping on our phone at crazy hours or crazy moments. And there's so much content out there. That's the other part of it. There's so much content. You could choose to waste an entire day on Instagram or any social aspect, right? Or even traditional digital content because it comes to your feed, right? My Google feed tells me right now about Colorado skiing or skiing in general, trail ultra running, and then NHL hockey, right? Because that's what AI knows what I want, and it comes to me. And so there's many times where I go to my phone just to Google something. I'm like, oh, what's the story? I read part of the story, right? And so I feel like I'm part of the problem and also getting sucked into it, So I think, unfortunately, there's so much content out there that comes to me. Like, I haven't gone to runnersworld.com in years, right? There's no more organic kind of going to the brand of the media really anymore. I mean, like, because I do work for Trailrunner, I often go to trailrunnermag.com, but like, I don't go to iRunFar. You don't, the need to go to maybe the ability of the time scope to go to one of those URLs is kind of lost because all that content is being pushed to you anyway. So I get all the content from Runner's World. I get all the content from iRunFar in my feed, and I see it in my phone. And so that's kind of where the content audience kind of continuum is right now. It's on your phone, right? It's like, and it comes to you, right? And like, so and part of the problem with that is there's so much content adding in, whoever you're seeing on social media, whatever your social media channel of choice is that it tends to become white noise, right? And that's a little bit of a danger I'm kind of hyper aware of, So back to your original question, have I written about clickbait stuff? Not much. I mean, I've tried to avoid that. I think there's two different kinds of clickbait stuff. There's clickbait for clickbait's sake, which is, kind of also tied to like the look at me influencer side of the influencers. Those are authentic influencers. And then there's like, look at me, look what I'm doing and whatever. I think that there still is a need as a journalist, as someone who writes for traditional or whatever media outlets, to be able to write stories that we think or we believe based on analytics and SEO will attract a lot of eyeballs, right? I mean, we can write the main story, the common story. Oh, so-and-so wins the Boston Marathon, but then there's also more stories that, will be there. And you've got to pick and choose as to which ones based on hopefully your professional experience, some level of SEO understanding and analytics, and then be able to write a story in that realm or in trail running that tells a story that gets more eyeballs. As to what goes viral in this world, you can never really predict that, but certainly there is an interest as a writer, as a journalist, as a content creator, whatever you want to call yourself, to tell interesting stories, hopefully. but also not be swayed by, having to have or doing it just for the clicks,
Well, Brian, this has been an awesome conversation. I can't thank you enough for your time. I think we covered a lot of great ground. We'll make sure to link to all of your relevant social media, your blogs, articles, etc. in the show notes. Before we go, do you have any final thoughts or calls to action that you want to share with the audience?
Well, first of all, it's been great conversation. I always appreciate talking to people that are immersed in the sport for the authenticity of it. And I think that this has been great. I think these topics or questions have been spot on. Believe me, I've been on a few podcasts where you can tell it's out of left field, but I think it's always good both for us, but also for the sport, for the listeners to understand the stuff in a more properly nuanced way, right? There's certainly a lot of things being capturing your attention right now. Barkley, prize money, UTMB, all this stuff. I think that certainly understanding it from hopefully informed ways is better than not. As for the whole UTMB / anti-UTMB thing, I think there's some interesting nuances there. The one thing I'll say is that, again, I'm a journalist. I'm not a UTMB apologist. I have no material stake in these things. But I think that in seeing the UTMB kind of come, the first time I was there was 2010. I remember Chrissy Mail telling me at a trade show once in 2003 or 4 or 5, "Oh, Brian, you got to go cover this race. It's so crazy. It's so cool." Right. And finally getting over there to see it really opened my eyes. Again, the authenticity of those races is brought by every single runner who attempts to run those courses. The hoopla that's been around it was mostly started and grown up by that, right? I mean, certainly the Pilettis, I know, get a lot of flack. They were interested in creating this authentic race when it was just 80 people, right? And so were they opportunistic to grow it? Maybe, but who wouldn't either? It's I think a lot of their interpretation of things also has gotten lost in the language barrier that exists or in the time zones that exist, right? They do a lot of stuff. They talk a lot in French, obviously, and it's a little bit lost, or for years not ever even making it to the U.S. market, right? So I think there's a lot of that maybe is lost. I think they're certainly willing to change and make changes. I think also European and American political values or social call to action is different. I mean, we've seen a lot of different changes here in the last couple of years, and everyone here is quick to respond, oh yeah, we need to have this category, we need to do this, we need to accommodate for these people, and that's great. I think that they're willing to do that as well. It's just slower to happen. But that being said, I think that again, I think there's pros and cons to all that, and I think there's plenty of space, and will continue to be for authentic grassroots parts of the sport. And at that level, if you're an ultra runner that lives in Denver and wants to run great races, there's great races right outside your back door here. High Lonesome being one of them, a series in Steamboat, all these different things. The sport will thrive at that level, right? And there's always going to be that opportunity. And so I think that, again, there's and then if you aspire to travel or to be competitive at a higher level, fortunately, there's a network of races that certainly have come of age because of that need and that desire, both for the competitive aspect, but also, again, the consumer runner, the middle of the pack runner who wants to experience these things they've experienced in their backyard in Denver, somewhere around the world.
I got to add on to that. I've now been over to Chamonix in August for UTMB twice. It's extremely hard to go over there, embed yourself for 7 to 10 days, not feel the magic, and come back to the States feeling incredibly energized, inspired, and sympathetic towards what they're trying to build. We did have an excellent conversation with Caleb Efta, as we mentioned earlier. He has his viewpoint on the situation. I am chomping at the bit in a very positive way to get Andrew Messick from Ironman on the podcast, as well as Michael Piletti or Catherine Piletti on the pod as well, to talk about their side of the coin. So I'll leave it at that, but I agree with everything you said.
Yeah, I think that would be great to get him on for sure. I think that, again, I feel the same way about Chamonix. I was just there on my own accord, mostly to ski, but I find that to be a magical place, just as I find Silverton, Colorado, or Leadville, Colorado to be a magical place, right? You're inspired by different things. I'm inspired by mountains. And I think that even in the times I've been to Chamonix, not doing the events to professionally cover them, write about them, I've been inspired to run the trails because there's such an awe about the mountains and like what, as an individual, just to run the trails is inspiring to me. And so I think that's certainly a big part of why I understand maybe kind of what UTMB has done. And like, I know people give Ironman a lot of grief, and I'm not going to speak about that too much, but it's not, UTMB was always this big, magnificent thing well before Ironman ever showed up. And again, to me, from the first touch point where Chrissy Mail was telling me I need to go cover this, and then hearing stories from, Scott Jurek, and then watching Americans go over there, women do well and American men fail. It was already a big thing, but the big thing, the enormity of it started out of this really connection to the authenticity of trail running, and it just became the thing, and so I think that again, I love what Caleb's talking about. I love what Caleb's doing, and yet he's creating races on the same manner, through authenticity, but they're growing and getting popular because of that same passion we've all shared. I think that's the common root for all this stuff. So, again, I think there's a place for everything, and ultimately, yeah, the consumers, the consumer runners amongst us will vote, by what we go to do and what we run, and that then the money will follow that.